Hello and welcome to the Faith Under Fire podcast, brought to you by Aid to the Church in Need, Ireland. I'm your host, Wendy Grace. In this month's episode, I will chat to a young Irish Dominican priest, Father Conor McDonagh, about his faith, his vocation and his ministry. He'll particularly reflect on how online preaching can reach those who are searching for faith. Later, Father Shane Gallagher is going to talk to us about the gift of motherhood and how mothers can be collaborators with God for his plan for themselves and their families. Later, I will go beyond the headlines, bringing you news from Nigeria, getting insight from one bishop into one of the world's most dangerous dioceses. But first, I wanted to talk to you about our prayer life. Well, how is your prayer life these days? You can really have highs and lows in this area, can't you? Times of desolation, times of spiritual dryness, and then you can have times of spiritual consolation. It's something Mother Teresa talked about, her many years of spiritual dryness, yet she still persisted with her prayer. Maybe you have really good habits, or maybe you kind of thought, well, I've had good habits over the years, but I've fallen out of them. Or maybe you're so habitual that your prayer can kind of end up where it's a little bit hollow, it's a little bit disconnected, you know, that thing where you're just kind of going through the motions. So what can you actually do to improve your prayer life, but in ways that are practical, in ways that are actually achievable? Maybe you're saying, well, I say my rosary or my divine mercy, but am I actually connecting with God? Of course, it's not that habitual prayer is bad. Good habits are obviously a really positive thing. It's more that if we're, as I said, doing that thing of going through the motions, are we actually having that conversation? Are we actually having that connection with God? Being consistent, as I said, it's really good. But sometimes we might actually not be opening our hearts. We mightn't actually be opening our minds to God if we're just saying, okay, I have to tick this box. I have to say my rosary today, or I have to listen to my gospel today, or whatever it is. At the end of the day, ask yourself this question. What is actually the purpose of prayer? What's the point of it? Well, the point is meant to be fostering a relationship with God. Fostering a relationship with God so that we can follow him, so that we can love him, so that we can truly see how much he loves us. And ultimately, the hope is by having this relationship with God that we will get to heaven. For many of us, you know, the idea of meditating in silent prayer can some days feel impossible. Most evenings when we're trying our very short period of family prayer time, you can't help but laugh at the many interruptions and interjections from a 2, 4 and 6-year-old in our house. Or sometimes it's just sheer exhaustion, you know, that leaves you just wanting to be distracted in other ways. Of course, that's not necessarily a good thing, but it's hard not to feel distracted. I know for me, even if I get those 5 or 10 minutes and I try to create that place where, you know, an environment where it's good for silent prayer, there's so many things coming into my head, so many plates that are spinning. So I think one of the first things is, well, what is realistic? For some people, maybe you can do 15 minutes a day. Can it even be 10? Maybe it could be more, depending on your current situation. But is prayerful silence for you achievable at the morning time? Maybe for you it's saying, you know what, before my feet hit the floor, before the kids wake up, or before I start thinking about work, or whatever the case may be, it's that restful time in bed. That's where I can find that silence before my brain starts firing and I think of all the things I have to do. Or maybe it's saying, okay, I have to rise 10 minutes earlier, you know, before the chaos starts in the house. Or maybe actually for you, it's nighttime. Or maybe it's after doing the school run with the kids, where you can just have silence in the car. The point is, there isn't something prescriptive here. Of course, getting into an adoration chapel is a wonderful thing to be able to do as well. But again, I'm trying to bring it back to, well, what's achievable and what's realistic and what works for you. And you know what? Maybe you need to try a few things and you'll go, got it. It is that quiet time in the car. Or it is when I'm out on a walk and I take the earbuds out, or I have the earbuds in, just listening to Gregorian chant helping me pray. Whatever it is. I would say, though, that a really good habit to try and get into is to start your day with gratitude, starting your day with that morning offering where you're offering the day to God, the highs, the lows, the hopes, the hurts, and you're giving it over to him for that day. And also a good habit to form at the end of the day is an examination of conscience. And going back to what I was chatting about earlier is making sure that these habits don't become hollow, that you are really taking that moment to connect with God. Well, the examination of conscience at the end of the day is looking back over your day on what went well and also where you fell down. And you fell down and fell short. But it's also that moment to have gratitude once again for what God did for you in those moments, the good and the bad. You know, St. Ignatius advises us that in this moment to think about, well, what's God done in your day? But also, how have you responded to what God has done in your day? What did you do well? What can you improve upon? Remember, God is always there. And unlike other relationships, He's actually the one always willing to bend and accommodate our schedule. He is just ready and willing to want to connect with us. Another thing to think about is what helps you pray. Is it reading scripture? Is it using an app to listen to a daily meditation? Is it praying with music? Again, this isn't about being prescriptive. It's saying, well, what works for you? See what works for you and then stick with it. Look, I know all of these things are easier said than done. But you know what? I always find it's the days where I'm so tired and the last thing I want to do is pray and my mind is saying just go and watch junk on TV, that when I push through and I say no, this is important, that's when the prayer is most fruitful. That's when the connection is there. Sometimes I think that relationship with God is kind of bringing it back to our understanding of worldly relationships. Let me give you this example. You know, if you get good news or bad news, who's the person that you want to share it with? Maybe it's your spouse. If you're not married, it might be your best friend. It might be your mum or your dad, your brother or your sister. But it's that important news that you pick up the phone and the first thing you want to do is share it with them and tell them. Well, that's actually the relationship that God wants to have with us. He wants to be an intrinsic part of your day, woven into your day. Sometimes it can be as simple as taking a deep breath. Maybe you're having your allowances and you're pausing with the Lord. Or you're giving those extra few seconds in gratitude by praying your grace before meals or calling on Him, as I do many times a day, when you're being impatient with the kids. The other thing is that conversation and relationship is a two-way street. So a lot of time we might be speaking to God, but we also need to be listening. It's of course the listening part I think that a lot of us can find most challenging. That moment where we go, what is God trying to say to me? Because sometimes we don't want to hear what He has to say. Or it mightn't be what we were thinking or what we had hoped for or what we had planned. So how is He speaking to us? And of course, again, this is something that is different for everybody because He's connecting with us where we are, with who we are. And remember, God has something specific to say to us all. One of the things is just looking at practical ways to help your prayer life, like going to bed on time if you've decided you're going to rise 10 minutes earlier, or making a decision that instead of scrolling social media, you'll read even one page from a spiritual book. And, you know, for us, something that's worked well is, you know, instituting after a particular time, no screens, no phones. And you'll find that opens up the time and space for more prayer time. You need to figure out what helps your mind to be free with God. And that's going to be different for everyone. As I said earlier, for some people, it's in total silence, sitting still. For others, it's actually the opposite. It's a case of when your hands are busy, your minds are free. The key thing is making your prayer life achievable. And don't get downhearted when it doesn't feel like you're getting anywhere, because the only way to get better at praying and to learn how to pray is by praying. This is your authentic mindfulness. This is your self-care time with God. There are other things that you might like to try. Things that I've found really useful, for example, is reading the lives of saints. I started off with the patron saint of journalists, St. Maximilian Kolbe, and just reading the incredible story of his life. You might say, you know what, actually I prefer listening to audiobooks. You can try apps like the Hallow app or Pray As You Go. There are lots of different options, and I love on some of these apps, it's, you know, if you've got 5 minutes, if you've got 10 minutes, there's something you can click into. But I think whatever you're entering into, when you're planning on spending time with God, it's good to have that moment where you just pause, open your heart, try to tune out distractions. That could be just starting truly in a slow way by meditating, for example, as you say, the Our Father, picturing your heart opening to God and to Him being present with you, lifting up your heart and looking into the eyes of God and seeing His gaze upon you. If you were sitting with Jesus in front of you, what would you think you would see in Jesus' eyes for you? Love. Look, ultimately, prayer is a relationship between the divine and the human, between you and God. Pope Benedict described prayer as the school of hope. I think it is such an important tool on the path to happiness, but also, of course, to salvation. That's why we need to make prayer a priority. And remember, you can do it in any time and any place because God is with us. And of course, Jesus, before He ascended, promised us He would always be with us. And it's time now for this month's profile interview on the Faith Under Fire podcast. And this month I'm joined by a young Irish Dominican friar with the Irish province, Father Conor McDonagh. And he's going to talk to us later on just about his ministry, specifically preaching online and how he's reaching people that way. But the first thing I wanted to talk about, Father Conor, was just your faith. Was it always something that was important to you growing up?
Yeah, no, it was definitely a major part of our upbringing. And I'd say in a really, I suppose, a very natural sort of a way. So my parents both had strong faith, but in very different ways. I'd say my mum was probably a lot more expressive in her faith and was very influenced by the charismatic renewal and had an immense love of scripture. So it was kind of a normal thing growing up at home to see mum studying the scriptures and really loving them. And her Bible is just covered in notes, and she knows the scriptures inside out. So that was very, very influential for me growing up. And just kind of an atmosphere of prayer and praise in the home generally, in a way that it was kind of invitational. It wasn't like living in a monastery or anything like that. And we didn't even pray the rosary every day or anything like that. We'd pray the rosary, a few times a week together, and Sunday Mass and so on, and daily Mass during Lent, that kind of a thing. And then it was Dad actually who would bring us to daily Mass during Lent. So Dad, as I said, had a very strong faith, especially at times of crisis. It kind of came out the deep strength of his faith, even if he wasn't as expressive in the same way. So that was definitely there. And I suppose in terms of I'm one of 6 children, and at various different times, all my brothers and sisters have had differing relationships with the church. But one of them came into his faith in a big way when he was in his early 20s, and he let me know about something called Youth 2000. And so I went along to that when I was about 16 in Knock, at the festival there in Knock. Now it's in Clongowes. Before that, it was in Clonmacnoise, I think, and Roscrea. But in the early days, it was in Knock, and that was really where my faith kind of came alive. And it became my personal faith rather than just something inherited. And I became part of a broader community, became aware of myself.
Did you have that moment where you were thinking, okay, there's other young people? Because it's really interesting to hear, that, your mom's love of the scripture and the witness of your father. And I think that's so important, especially for boys and young men as they're growing up, to see their dad. I remember a priest once saying to me, look, when you're having so many with your children and you're kind of thinking, I just want to do best by them. They said, look, there's nothing more powerful than your children seeing their father and their mother, praying on their knees, and the impact that has.
Absolutely.
But
I remember
go on.
even being very small, I remember going into town with Dad, and one moment, there's a kind of a vivid memory. I must have been really, really small, but in the Augustinian church in Galway, and just looking up at my dad who was kneeling down, and it made such an impact on me. And I think it's a really important thing that as a small child, you see the biggest, most important people in your world kneeling down before something greater, and you become aware that they're not the ultimate authorities, and that they are worshipping one who is greater and all good. And that's really powerful. Yeah.
So you have the basis and your mum and dad kind of sowing the seeds and laying that really important foundation, Conor. But then, you get this experience with community and making friends in Youth 2000. What happened next? Did that just help things continue to grow? How was the college years and the teenage years and all that?
Yeah, well, it's funny you mentioned it, because when I went to Youth 2000 first, I actually felt really young at Youth 2000, and it changed quite a bit. But I mean, back then, it was kind of mid-20s was sort of more the average age there. Whereas now you go to a Youth 2000 event, and if you're in your mid-20s, you might feel a little bit old. So I didn't instantly get a ton of friends through it. I could just see these people, but they were slightly older than me. And then I went to university, and I suppose there I was challenged in my faith massively. By meeting so many. I went to university in England, and far less Catholic environment. When I was at secondary school in Galway, it was still pretty much everybody was Catholic to some extent or other. But then I went to this very, very different environment, and I was being really, really challenged. And I got very involved in my Catholic chaplaincy then. And that was really where, I really connected with people who were my peers, who were at exactly the same stage, had exactly the same experience. And we supported each other massively. It was really wonderful, a wonderful, wonderful time. We would have praise and worship in our college rooms. We had prayer meetings in the chaplaincy. We'd have lunch together every day in the chaplaincy. It was £1.50 for lunch, which was a bargain. So we would come together and eat tons of quiche from Sainsbury's, and we were in the library. So we're there recommending books to each other, reading books, and helping each other grow deeper in our faith, and to answer the questions that we were being asked by our friends who didn't believe. So there was that really strong sense of community, of prayer, of study, and then the sense of mission as well. And so when I then was reading about the lives of the saints and reading about the different religious orders, and I came across the Dominicans, and I saw that their pillars, the pillars of the Dominican life, are prayer, study, community life, and all with the aim of preaching the gospel.
So at this point then, were you thinking, when you were in college, were you thinking, okay, maybe I'm called to be a priest, or when did that moment happen?
Yeah. So that was, when I was very small, that was there kind of in my mind. I was kind of reading about the great saints, and I was saying, when I was like 8 years old, I was like, yeah, Lord, come on, I'll be a priest, I'll be a monk, I'll be whatever, These were kind of like the superheroes when I was, reading. There was a book I had called 60 Saints for Boys. And I was just like, yeah, these are the Marvel characters in my imagination. I was like, yeah, I'm ready to do it, But then it kind of drifted away in my teen years. But it definitely came back with a bang when I was at college. It was just that sense of mission, a sense of, encountering so many people who didn't know the Lord, and just having the sense that I was somehow made to do something about that. So that was where the kind of the religious vocation was growing from.
So what happened next? When you have that sense, thinking, okay, maybe this is what I'm called to. What happened next in the journey?
So next, I suppose I contacted the Dominicans. So I used to go to the Mass in the Dominican Church in Cambridge sometimes, and I was reading about the different saints, and I came across then, I remember it really, that there was a Dominican church in Galway that we used to go to. If we missed every other Mass on a Sunday and a Saturday evening, we go to the Sunday evening Mass, the 7:30 in the Claddagh. It's a beautiful church. Some of your listeners might know the Claddagh Church. Really, really stunning place, and just where the River Corrib meets the sea. It's a beautiful location. So we used to go to Mass there at times. And so I phoned them up when I was at home once. I remember being at home on my own in the house, didn't tell anybody. I just said, I'm just going to do it. I'll just phone them up, see who answers. And it was this lovely old priest called Father Terence McLaughlin, who's since gone to the Lord. And he was very gentle, very encouraging. And he said he would take my number and give it to the vocations director. And the vocations director called me and offered to come down the very next day. And I kind of thought, wow, these guys actually want vocations. These guys are serious about the mission. In other words, they're not giving up. They're not just rolling over and dying. They want to do this, So that was very, very impressive. And I was still in college. I began to go to live-ins, which is a way for, it's almost like dating when you're discerning a religious vocation. You go and you spend time in the religious community, maybe a weekend, and you live the life, and you get a much better sense of whether this is the life that God is calling you to or not.
I think it's really important for people to know that type of opportunity exists, because I think for women who might think they're called to religious life or men to be priests, it's a journey, isn't it? As you have that experience, it's not, okay, come into the seminary, you're going to lock the door now, that God wants you to discern the vocation.
No, exactly. And so many people, I meet them and they say they're discerning a vocation, but what they mean is they're thinking about it individually, privately, and they're praying about it privately. And I say that's great, but you need to take the next step, which is to actually concretely explore places, go to communities, and then very quickly you'll get a much clearer sense of whether this is where you're meant to be or not. And I remember one Dominican sister in Cambridge I met, she said to me, whatever you do, don't join the community of perpetual discernment. And a lot of people are in the community of perpetual discernment, where they're kind of open to the religious life, but they're not taking any concrete steps towards it. And that was really, really helpful to me.
One of the things that I think is so powerful is just the witness of at the habit. And I certainly remember being at World Youth Day many years ago in Madrid and seeing the beautiful sisters in their habits and the priests as well, and their black capes, and they were so cool. That witness I think has been so powerful, because it's so countercultural, not only just to be Catholic nowadays, but to say I am called to religious life or to priesthood. Do you think that there's more openness and curiosity? What's been your experience? I know you do a lot of work and preaching that's really trying to connect with young people. What's your experience been?
Well, that's a really interesting question. And I mean, literally on Sunday, there were three of us walking back from a conference through Temple Bar. So you can imagine Temple Bar, Sunday evening, bank holiday weekend, and we were just walking through the crowds. And I heard one fella, he was saying to his friends, they are real. They are real. They are. In other words, he thought his friend was suggesting that we were a stag party, which often we're mistaken for when we travel in a group. And he was saying, no, look at them. They are real. And we had a good few conversations with people along the way. We were stopped and so on. And that's definitely my experience, is that the habit is a powerful way to provoke encounters with people, and to arouse questions in people. I think that's really the main function of the habit for me, as well as a reminder to me of my duty and my consecration and my calling. But I'd say with younger people, there's definitely a real curiosity. So I go into a lot of schools, and not in any systematic way, but just occasionally I'd get invited into a school, and I find that often the younger people, there can be an initial hostility or uncertainty, but after a very short time of chatting, that'll melt away, and there'll be real curiosity and real interest. And that's not necessarily the case among their teachers. So there can be kind of maybe a slight hardness among that middle generation, but the younger generation are genuinely curious and really open in a way that's quite unexpected. And I find this in universities as well. I mean, in UCD, for example, at the moment, there are incredible fruits, and in Queen's and Belfast too, really incredible fruits being born through kind of campus missionary efforts. And we kind of come into that as Dominican friars and help along as best we can. But it's really striking just how there's this great openness there among a younger generation who know very, very little about the faith, but who are genuinely curious about all of this.
It's an interesting point that you touched on, Father Connor, just that for a younger generation, there's, in a way, is it kind of a silver lining that those who aren't catechized at all and don't know their faith at all, there's an opportunity there because there's an openness, and I've certainly found that there isn't maybe baggage of the past that maybe an older generation might have. But obviously one of the key ways to connect with a younger generation, well, with most people nowadays actually, is using the kind of online world. But it's easier said than done because there's so much out there to distract us, and attention spans are so short. But I know this is something that you're very passionate about. Tell us a little bit about your ministry online.
Yeah, so I mean, we organize our mission. We govern our mission by means of provincial chapters, which are meetings that take place every 4 years. Each of the Dominican houses in Ireland will elect people to go, and then that body will then elect the new provincial and come up with a plan for the next 4 years. And I was at that 2 years ago, and I was really banging the drum for online preaching. I was saying this is where we need to be. And others were, absolutely agreeing. But it was based on the idea that Saint Dominic was always most interested in. 800 years ago, he was most passionate about those who were furthest from the church. That's what motivated him. It wasn't primarily a pastoral concern for the people who were already in the pews. I mean, that's a worthy and a noble concern. But he had been doing that. So he was a kind of a canon, if you like, in the cathedral in Osma, and he'd been doing the kind of the work with those who were committed already to the church. But it was when he encountered people who were distant from the church, these heretics, groups of heretics in the south of France, and then he began to hear about pagans beyond the boundaries of Christendom, and just his heart was broken, and he began to kind of dream of a preaching mission to these people, and that's where our order was born. So the idea then was to say, well, the internet is where everybody is. And if we're not active there, if we're not actively engaging people who are distant from the church, then we're not living up to Dominic's dream for the 21st century. So that was really I was banging that drum really, really loudly, and I was banging it so loudly that I got given that job. So we have a role now within the Irish province of Dominicans, the promoter of online preaching, and I kind of coordinate various different efforts on that front. And one thing we decided very early on was that we would need to employ a professional on a full-time basis to work with us so that we could produce content regularly and consistently, that it wouldn't just be an occasional flash in the pan. That's not how social media works. You need to be really consistent in the production of content. So we employed a young man called Patrick Grant, who's really, really skilled, and he's doing wonderful work with us. And that's been my more or less full-time work this year. And I'll keep it up next year as well, alongside all the other things I'm doing. But yeah, so that's the main work I'm involved in at the moment.
And what sort of a response are you getting, especially from young people? Because I think when there's so many people that are identifying with what you're saying, they're saying, okay, I need to use the online world to try and share my faith, to try and connect. But that can be really difficult too, to know the kind of best way to go about it. And then obviously it's different to a one-to-one, face-to-face conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. And I suppose we're trying many different things at once. And we've been inspired by people like yourselves, who have been pioneering in this area for several years. And we're trying to work with other people who are, feeling their way in this field at the moment, and how best to go about it. So we're certainly not on our own doing this. But I would say the different platforms, it's really important to be aware of how the different platforms work. And Instagram is something quite new for us. But it's been quite a positive experience for us being on Instagram. TikTok, we're not kind of going near TikTok at the moment, we've no immediate plans to do so. And Twitter, we've decided that that's not really a medium we want to be engaging in a very active way as kind of online preaching, at least not as the Irish Dominicans. So I'm on there personally, but not as the Irish Dominicans. Whereas Instagram, there's something interesting about it. It's more about kind of showing people beautiful things and cool things, and it's a much more of a positive atmosphere. So we've been producing lots of reels and photos there, and some of them have been really, really popular. So it can be difficult to work with the Instagram algorithm and to figure out how to reach people. But I mean, one of the reels, it reached about 40,000 people viewed it, and for a while there, we were getting regularly 15,000 views on each of the reels we were posting. So that was really, really exciting. Now with the algorithm, that's changed, and we're not exactly sure why. So it's that kind of, we need to work on the technical side of things, and kind of maybe do a bit of consultation with people who know how these things work, to try and figure that one out. But it is fascinating to see that it can work, and it can work really beautifully, and you can be genuinely popular in an Irish social media context when you're sharing the gospel. One thing we've done as well is we're trying to tap into the interests of people who are perhaps not actively practicing their faith, but who are interested in Irish history and heritage, and local history and heritage. And I think that's the great benefit of being in Ireland versus being in the States, for example. In Ireland, if you kind of scratch the surface in any field, you're going to find a saint. You're going to find some beautiful Christian story. The island is just baptized beautifully, and there's just such a rich Christian heritage here. So that's one of the things we've been doing, is to make a series of videos, 10 videos in each county in Ireland. That's the ambition, which is going to take several years, to visit sites of Christian heritage and to tell the beautiful, inspiring, and sometimes surprising stories of what happened in those places. So that's a series called Treasure Ireland, and there we're working on multiple platforms. So it's on YouTube. That's where we post it, on the Irish Dominicans YouTube channel, and then we cut up those longer videos into shorter bits, which we post on Instagram, for example, and then we share them also on Twitter and on Facebook. It's interesting. It's really important, I think, not to leave behind the older generation in all of the work we're doing, and the older generation is very much on Facebook, and so I think that's it's important not to leave those people behind. And then on WhatsApp. So this is a really, I said, well, what about setting up a WhatsApp group? A few people had mentioned it to us. They said, we'd love to get these via WhatsApp so we can forward them to our friends. And we set up a WhatsApp group, and recently we hit the max in the group. So we have 1,024 people there. We've had to set up a second group, and it's fascinating to see how many people are sharing it with their friends. So we will post something about a saint who lived in County Laois, and then instantly you can share this with your friend from County Laois. And it's a way to gently evangelize. So you have this youngish priest who's kind of presenting the story, and that's surprising to some people. And then you have an inspiring Christian story that's told in your backyard. And again, that kind of gently evangelizes people. So that's what we've been doing. And also we work through print media and radio as well. So when we do a series, we will make contact with the local journalists. So for example, we're doing County Laois at the moment, and Laois Today, this kind of major newspaper in the area, they shared a really brilliant story in collaboration with us on this new series. So you're kind of trying to burst out of the Catholic bubble and reach people who have maybe drifted a little bit from the practice of the faith, but are nevertheless interested in the local story. And you try to show them, well, the local story is a story in which Christ is abundantly present.
You know, it's so inspiring to hear just the creative ways where you're kind of saying, okay, let's step outside the bubble and try to reach people where they're at. And I think that's something that's so important. And for a lot of people listening, I think sometimes, you know, say, for example, for me, right, when we went to Mass this Sunday and the previous week, you know, there'd been Holy Communions and sadly, you know, very few were back again the next week. And there can be these moments where you feel really downhearted about, you know, just that not as many people, especially young people, are engaging with the faith. But that can be counterproductive as well when you're just kind of negative. Do you feel hopeful just with all these initiatives that you're doing, Father Conor, about a new springtime in the church? It's something people are talking about these days.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, so I was thinking about kind of evangelization of those who are kind of drifting, but also our work, we're really attempting to build up the confidence of believers. And I think that's really, really important, because some lies can creep in from the world around us about our faith, you know, not being something that is true and good and beautiful. And these can creep into us, and kind of we can have this sort of doubt festering within us, or kind of a shame. And there's a proper shame associated with some of what was done in the name of the church in Ireland. There's a proper shame associated with that we need to really acknowledge and be humble and penitent about. But at the same time, to, as Bishop Barron says, you know, to tell our own story and not always to listen to other people telling our story. And in telling our own story, we are honouring the God who has been at work throughout the history of Ireland and the history of the Irish Church. And so we're reminding believers of the beauty of our own story. I think that's really, really important, that our own confidence will grow, that we'll say, yeah, this is true. Just look at all of these stories that result from faith in Christ, and why wouldn't I follow Christ with all my heart in our time? So I think that's another important aspect. It's about, you know, reaching out gently to those who are drifting, but those who are there already, to build up their own confidence. I think that's really important. As for signs of a new springtime, I mean, it's all in God's hands. And I think, you know, institutionally, my sense is that we're going to see things fall apart very quickly, very soon, in terms of church buildings and parishes. And I really think it's important that you know, believers are ready for this, and that they're not disheartened by it, that they know it's kind of inevitable. I mean, it's not, you know, when a church closes or a parish closes, it's not that, you know, the bishop is taking a decision to shut down the life of the church. It's recognizing, okay, this thing is you know, hollowed out from within. Let's reorganize the life of the church locally for the sake of future generations. And sometimes in Ireland, we're holding on to current structures in a way that actually weakens our ability to work for future generations. So I would say really to have that future-oriented mindset when we're letting go of the various things that we have to let go of. It'll be really, really painful for people, but I think it's just necessary just to recognize the weakness of our current situation institutionally, but above all then to prioritize the following of Christ and our openness to the work of the Holy Spirit, that personal holiness, which is really the foundation for any springtime worth the name.
Yeah, that's where it all has to focus on. A really lovely place to end our chat. Father Conor McDonagh, thank you so much for joining us on the Faith Under Fire podcast today, and we certainly will be praying for you and for your ministry. Maybe let the listeners know how they can check out your online preaching.
Yeah, absolutely, and really thanks so much for having me here. It's a real pleasure, and I love all of the work you're doing. We can, if you go onto YouTube, have a look at Irish Dominicans. Just search for Irish Dominicans on YouTube and you'll find our channel, and you can like all the videos and subscribe to the channel. On WhatsApp, if you contact us via our Facebook page and ask to be added to our WhatsApp group, we will do that. So Facebook page again is Irish Dominicans. We're on Instagram also, not very imaginative. We're Irish Dominicans on Instagram as well. And if you're on Twitter, we're Irish Dominicans there. So if you follow us and so on, you'll find out everything we're doing. And yeah, it's great to build a community. So yeah, just to join in the work of our mission as well.
Yes, and it has been just wonderful just to discuss it all with you today. I've been chatting to Father Conor McDonagh. Father Conor, thank you so much for being our guest on the Faith Under Fire podcast today. Now it's time to go beyond the headlines. So this is the part of the podcast where I bring you stories of Christian persecution from around the world, stories that are often underreported or indeed not reported at all. Now this first story is just giving you a bit of an insight into life of the bishop of one of the world's most dangerous dioceses. This archbishop is looking after one of the world's most dangerous dioceses, and he now has 5 guard dogs to protect him at home, and he has to travel around with an armed escort. Archbishop Matthew Ngogoso of Kaduna in northern Nigeria basically had a chat to Aid to the Church in Need recently, and he was just talking about life in his diocese. Now his diocese is in northern Nigeria, and he was just talking about the 8 of his priests that have been kidnapped in just 3 years. Now out of those 8 priests, 3 of them were killed, 1 is still missing, and the others were freed. One of the things that he just talked about was the murdered priests just showing particular tremendous courage. He said that while they were pointing AK-47s at one particular priest, he told his attackers they should repent of their evil, and then they killed him. When we just look at the general situation in Nigeria, it is just getting increasingly dangerous for Christians in Nigeria, in particular the northern part of Nigeria. Now, this was something that really was highlighted in Aid to the Church in Need's 2022 edition of Persecuted and Forgotten. This is a report that focuses on how Christians are oppressed and persecuted for their faith. So just looking at the period of January 2021 and June 2022, Islamist extremists fueled the killing of more than 7,600 Nigerian Christians and abducted 5,200. This is according to ACN's findings. Now, Archbishop Ngogoso said that priests in many regions of Nigeria had to weigh up the risk. They had to think about it before travelling. He said, that they often passed by vehicles on the roads which have been attacked, and just that reminder that it could happen to them at any moment. One of the most powerful things that he said was that faith doesn't fall from the sky. It needs ministers. But we know that we run risks whenever we send somebody somewhere. He said we are returning to the first days of the church. Archbishop Ngogoso said that Islamists and others wanted to create division and wanted to create conflict in the country. And that was one of their aims. They're trying to pit Christians and Muslims against each other. But he was really trying to impress upon us that religion should be the thing that unites us, not divides us. And he talked a little bit about his own early life story, just talking about the potential for good interfaith relations. And I think this is something that we have to really, really focus on. He said he was born to a leader of a traditional religion, but asked to be baptised when he was just 10 years old because he was attending a Catholic school. And when the Archbishop was talking about it, he said his father never reproached him for the decision. He said he was happy I converted. He said he would have preferred he got married, but they were supportive of him all the same. So it was so interesting to hear the perspective of the Archbishop Ngogoso, the Archbishop of Kaduna in northern Nigeria, just getting an on-the-ground account when he was speaking to Aid to the Church in Need. And that is just one of the important pieces of work that ACN does, is doing practical things on the ground, but going beyond the headlines, doing what we're doing now is making sure that we're getting the real story. And again, just sticking with Nigeria now, another story that you probably haven't heard of because these things are so underreported. And again, I just want to stick with Nigeria to another story, which is in relation to yet another kidnapping. And this is the kidnapping of a Catholic priest, Father Jude Kingsley Maduka. And this is the latest kidnapping, as I've already touched on, in a long series of kidnappings where there is just bandits targeting church personnel. And it's just a common occurrence. And sadly, as well as kidnappings being a common occurrence in Nigeria, so is the slaughter of Christians. And recently in early June was the anniversary of when more than 40 Christians were killed in an attack on St. Francis Xavier's Church in southwest Nigeria. Now, Father Emmanuel Fawa, who is the rector of the St. Albert Institute in the Kafkan Diocese, he told Aid to the Church in Need that the 41 people who lost their lives during the Pentecost Sunday Mass are martyrs, and he believes that the first step of their path to sainthood should be set in motion. When he was speaking about it, he said, for me as a priest in the Holy Roman Catholic Church, it would not be a bad idea if the Church decides to open a cause for the beatification of those who lost their lives in that attack because they died professing their faith. He went on to say they died while worshipping God in his own house. So if the Church were to open a process for the beatification, that would go a long way to strengthen the faith of those who are practicing their faith in war-torn areas, in areas like northern Nigeria, where most of those who go by the name of Christians are persecuted. Of course, 70 others were wounded as well, many with life-changing injuries, and that attack took place on the 5th of June 2022. I wanted to move now to a story in Pakistan where two bishops in Pakistan have demanded that security be tightened in schools across the country. Now, the reason that this call has been made is that two girls at a Catholic college were shot dead by a police officer working as a guard. Now, 5 other children and a woman were also injured in the shooting, which happened at Sangota Public School. This is in the Swat Valley, and it's run by the Sisters of the Presentation of the Blessed Virgin Mary. It's in the northeast part of Pakistan. Now, the officer has been arrested, and this incident happened on the 16th of May, and there's an ongoing inquiry. Now, Archbishop Joseph Arshad of the Islamabad Rampilndi Diocese includes that the school told the Catholic charity Aid to the Church in Need. He said, "We feel threatened and insecure in the midst of growing terrorism in the country." He said, "We demand that the guard should be punished to avoid similar incidents happening in future." Furthermore, Archbishop Sebastian Shaw of the Lahore Diocese also condemned the threat posed to groups opposed to girls' education, and he said that the authorities had to do much more to keep schools safe. He said that the man was in charge of security for the children, the staff, the parents, everybody. That's what he was paid for. But in a moment of madness, he did this because the school teaches girls. This shows how aggressive these groups are that are opposed to women's education. Everybody has a right to education. He went on to say that there's an atmosphere of insecurity. He said that's why the government has to do more to protect the institutions and the people who are committed to important things like education and health. Now, the Church in Pakistan has asked all Catholic schools in the country to observe a day of prayer in solidarity with the victims of the attack. Now, this particular school actually previously had to close for 3 years after Islamist fundamentalists destroyed the building in 2009. One of the things that a report from ACN in 2021, which was called Hear Her Cries, that reported the growing number of kidnappings and forced conversions of Christian women and girls in Pakistan. And this story just highlights once again the oppression, in particular of Christian women and girls in Pakistan. That was Beyond the Headlines, and of course we have to pray for the stories that I have shared with you today. And indeed, you can find out more information on many of these stories on ACN's website, acnireland.org. It's now time for this month's pastoral reflection, and Father Shane Gallagher is going to be my guest today. And Father Shane has been reflecting recently on motherhood and how important it is, but also how mothers can be collaborators with God and his plan for them and their families. So Father Shane, what got you thinking about this topic in the first place?
I suppose I was preparing work for the month of May, and I was thinking up various topics on what was the best topic to approach for the month of May. And it just happened to coincide with my mum's anniversary. My mum died of cancer about 6 years ago now. And we were very broken as a family. All families are to lose a parent, and particularly a mum. No disrespect to the poor daddies out there, but mums are the glue, the cement, the foundational stone in the house. And it just got me thinking about the significance of motherhood and how important it is. And when you take the mother out of a house, it can pretty much cause havoc. Mums they're like a peacekeeping force in the house too, and they're a communications center hub as well. So many different aspects. There are many different aspects to motherhood, and of course, it is God's great plan for humanity, for the world. To bring creation to its full potential through mothers who are instruments of God. Yeah.
And, you know, what was interesting in your reflection, Father, was just how you're saying, here I am, and a lot of people would identify with this, you know, as a grown adult and you lose a parent, especially a mother, as you say, and your world kind of crumbles for a time, and that loss is still felt. I mean, I still see with my own mum, I never even met my grandmother yet. She's had an influence on me just knowing about her and her life, but my own mum, looking at her mother, my grandmother, who's dead over 40 years, and each year around her anniversary, her heart still breaks a little, which just shows you the impact, doesn't it, that mothers can have on, and not just through, but down through the generations.
Yeah, mothers are, you know, I was 40 when my mum died, and, you know, as a 40-year-old man, I struggled for quite a while. I found it very hard to get back on the road of life again. I was encouraged then by a good priest friend to go and talk to someone about it, process my feelings, and how, you know, to process grief. Grief is a very strong thing, and you know, I as a hospital chaplain, I meet kids, young teenagers, and children who lose their mums. Particularly to cancer and things like that, women who have died way beyond their years, who've died too young, sadly. And the strength of those kids is inspiring. But I struggled as a 40-year-old man. I really did. I found it very hard to get back into the groove again of life. It affected every sinew of my life, my thoughts, my sleep pattern. I wasn't sleeping properly for months afterwards. And I encourage anybody listening to this today to talk, definitely to talk and to communicate your feelings. First of all, to pray. I'd get the priority straight. Pray, then talk. And by talking, then you process. And then that also then aids the prayer life again then too. It's all very much interrelated.
Yeah.
But we're built to talk, and I think in Ireland there's this kind of thing with, you know, get on with it, just, you know, and just brush things under the carpet. We're great for talking about the football match on Sunday, or, you know, the horse race, or the you know, who was where and who was doing what, but we don't talk. We're not a great nation about talking about our feelings, particularly and men's, in the case of men as well. Women are better in that department, and men are better in other departments then too. I won't run men down totally, Wendy. You know, but women and men have their strengths and their weaknesses. I think it's a weakness for men, particularly to process and to talk about feelings, particularly in the area of grief, and for young men and for men who've lost their mums. And the Irish thing too is a lot of boys are very close to their mums too. Now, I'm not saying that daughters aren't close to their mums. Of course they are. But I always notice that girls always have that little bit of closeness with their dads that boys maybe wouldn't have, particularly in the Irish experience, you know. But definitely, yeah, I wanted to give honour to mums. I reflected on my own mother, particularly at the 6th anniversary, the impact that she had on me, helping me on my vocational journey too, to become a priest. I wouldn't have become a priest without my mother. And that's the impact that mums have in houses. They encourage, they nurture, they communicate, they bandage wounds, you know, not just physical, but emotional as well. If you've had a bad week, you ring up your mum. You know, mums are they're great confidants as well. You can, you know, share everything. You feel safe. It's a safe environment around a mum. And when that's taken away, well, then it's very hard. You can't replace it. I've never really replaced that intimacy that I've had with my mum with any other human being in this world. And it's not meant to be, because your mum, you're just meant to have that really, and God designed it so.
Yeah, that was my next question is this the way that God ordained motherhood to be, this close connection? And, you know, in as far as we can, I remember a priest saying to me once when I was, you know, giving the litany of my failures of the mother from impatience and lots of different things, and thinking of the many, you know, 3 o'clock in the morning cribside vigils I'd be praying. He said, you have to look to Our Lady. You ask her for help. She's the ultimate model. Did God ordain it that way, that we should obviously see Our Lady as a role model, but that children would have this close connection with their biological mother, and then with the view then to having that connection with their heavenly mother?
Well, one example stands out there when you mention Our Lady, and of course Our Lady is the creme de la creme of mums, if I may put it like that. You know, I think of the story of little Karl Wojtyła, as a little boy, I think around 6 years of age. He lost his mother. Later on then, in his teen years, he would come to know a Carmelite mystic called Tiranovsky, who really helped him on the roadway to priesthood and in his relationship with God. But I think through Tiranovsky's influence too, Pope John Paul very much got to know Our Lady. His father's influence too was very strong, because he prayed the rosary in his apartment in Krakow with his daddy in his prepubescent years and then going into teen years. So I think Pope John Paul would have acknowledged himself later to be Saint Pope John Paul, that when his own earthly mother died, he then turned to his heavenly mother and he said, "Now you will be my mother." And I think I've tried to approach it like that too in my priesthood and my life. I've turned to our heavenly mother. Now that my earthly mother is gone, I turn to my heavenly mother. And it's a point that and thank you for reminding me of that point, that it was the rosary and devotion to Our Lady that certainly helped me to get back on my feet again. Did the grief go away? No, it didn't. But Our Lady helped to cushion the blow, certainly through that most powerful prayer of the rosary. And you'll notice too that all the popes, when they write an encyclical letter, is very noticeable, or they write an apostolic exhortation or whatever else, they always mention Our Lady at the end of each letter. Our Lady is very much through her intercessory power, she's very much a great aid to anybody who has lost a parent, and particularly in the area of mums, So, yeah, I attribute my healing. I'm not totally healed yet from my mother's death. I don't think we're fully healed ever from any death, but certainly Our Lady has helped to cushion the blow.
Yeah, and one of the things as well that you have reflected on, I know, Father Shane, is how mothers can act as a collaborator in God's plan. How should we be praying about that? How does that all work?
Well, mums are great collaborators, and strange, I was talking about vocations there, and a few weeks ago I was working in a parish, and was talking about the town of Ulu Monteferrara. There's a little town, it's outside Turin, and in that little town, which hasn't a huge population, but within about a period of 60 to 70 years, they produced I think between 200 to 300 priests, religious sisters, and consecrated, all because the mums of the parish decided to get together to pray the rosary after Mass for vocations. And in that one little village, over 200 to 300 vocations came about. So, that story typifies to me, it illustrates very clearly how mums are collaborators, and how God and Our Lady delight when mums turn to God, and they turn, and mums are a great force of faith in the house too. They if a mum is strong and she's teaching her children their prayers, that certainly is it's a bright thing. It provides for a bright future for her child, her child, wherever the child goes. Then, if the child finds themselves in New York or Sydney or wherever they happen to find themselves years later, they'll always remember their mum's prayers. And in times of crisis, then, particularly for children or young people too that have moved away from the church, many come back because of the memory of their mothers praying. Their mothers on their knees praying. So mums are fabulous collaborators. And by their very nature too, mums are very docile. They're very self-sacrificing. Again, it's a quality that men do not have as much as women. Women are very, very sacrificing. It's a bit like the pelican feeding their young with their own blood. A mother is her docility to the Holy Spirit, and it's there. It's very clearly there, and you can see it in an awful lot of mums today. And my mother, particularly, I thank my mother for the gift of the faith. I thank my father too, of course. But mum, she left a lasting legacy in our house, certainly, and that was because she was a collaborator.
And how do we foster a collaborative spirit as mums? And indeed, how do fathers support that?
Yeah, well, it's a double act, isn't it, really? I think too, where dads are, I think statistics show, research shows where dads are not practicing their faith. I think sons don't practice their faith as much. So mums and dads both have a united role, really. I think it's just perseverance, having a schedule in the house, a nightly nightly prayer schedule, maybe to get the kids to, pray the rosary, to give each child a decade of the rosary, to include the children too in the prayers. Mums can do so much, and again too, that simple walk to the chapel. I remember my mum walking with my mum into the chapel, and mum explaining the tabernacle to me and things like that. So it's not rocket science. It's just simply by example, leading by example. That's how mums become collaborators, and being persistent, and they persevering too, and not giving up too on their child when they say at 18 that no, they don't want to go to mass anymore or whatever, that mums remain gentle and that they remain still in the child's life, not forcing, but always encouraging, always, and never to force, but always to encourage,
Yeah, and I think it will have been very encouraging for so many listening to you today. As always, Father Shane Gallagher, thank you so much for joining us on the Faith Under Fire podcast today. And thank you for joining us. That is it for me for this month. Do make sure that you subscribe on your favourite platform and share with family and friends. Remember, you can support the work of Aid to the Church in Need by going to acnireland.org. It is Aid to the Church in Need that brings you the Faith Under Fire podcast. And I've been your host, Wendy Grace. I'll talk to you soon. In the meantime, God bless you and all of your family.